As the waiter placed their entrees on the table, the weight in Ethan's chest only grew heavier. He had prepared for this night, hoping to salvage what was left of his marriage, but nothing could have prepared him for what came next. Maddie exhaled, setting down her glass of wine with an unsettling calm. She leaned in, her emerald green eyes locking onto his. "Ethan?" She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "I'm leaving you?" Silence crashed over the table like a tidal wave. Ethan didn't flinch, he simply smiled. Maddie's confidence wavered for the first time that night. Her lips parted, confusion flickering in her expression, and then, before she could speak again, the restaurant doors swung open. Ethan barely turned his head. He didn't need to. Maddie, however, went pale. Because the man who just walked in, he was the last person she ever expected to see. And he was here for her. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Ethan Carter had spent the last 20 years building a life most men only dreamed of. At 42, he was a self-made architect in Austin, Texas, known for his sharp eye for design and an even sharper mind for business. He had started from the ground up, working his way through college with long nights at a construction site, studying blueprints under dim fluorescent lights, learning every detail about what made a structure strong, enduring, timeless. That same philosophy had guided him through life: build something solid, invest in the foundation, and make sure that no storm could tear it down. His career reflected that belief. The sleek modern office buildings and custom homes that bore his name stood as proof of his talent, his relentless work ethic, and his ability to create something lasting. Clients respected him, colleagues admired him, and his employees knew him as a leader who expected the best because he gave nothing less. But beyond the accolades and success, Ethan had always measured his true wealth by his family. His marriage to Madeline, or Maddie as he had always called her, had once been the cornerstone of his world. At 39, she was still stunning, with the same captivating smile that had drawn him in when they were in their 20s. She had charm, wit, and an undeniable presence that made people gravitate toward her. When they first met, she had been a bright-eyed marketing graduate with ambition and a fire that matched his own. They had built a life together. 2 beautiful children, a gorgeous home, shared memories that, at one point, had felt unshakable. For years, Ethan had believed that their love was like the buildings he designed, structured, resilient, built to withstand the test of time. But lately, cracks had begun to form in that foundation. Subtle at first, like hairline fractures in a wall, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. It was the way Maddie started coming home later than usual, her excuses vague and unconvincing. The way she would turn her phone screen away when he walked into the room, a quick flick of her fingers to silence a notification. The way she had stopped looking at him the same way she used to, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture in their home. Familiar, functional, but no longer exciting. Ethan wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but he was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts told him something was wrong. He tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to stress, to the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. They had been through rough patches before, times when work had consumed him, times when the demands of parenthood had drained them both. But this felt different. There was a distance between them now, one that stretched wider each day, no matter how hard he tried to bridge the gap. Conversations had become transactional, filled with discussions about the kids, errands, schedules, everything except them. The warmth had faded, replaced by something colder, something detached. And then there were the lies, small at first but undeniable. The business trips that didn't quite add up, the dinners with friends that he never got to meet, the lingering scent of a cologne that wasn't his on her clothes. Ethan had spent years designing spaces meant to stand the test of time, but now, as he sat in the home they had built together, he couldn't shake the feeling that his marriage was already collapsing, piece by piece. Midnight Bistro was the kind of place that exuded elegance without trying too hard. Nestled in the heart of Austin, it was the perfect blend of intimacy and sophistication, dimly lit with warm amber lighting, polished wood accents, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Soft jazz played in the background, the kind that added atmosphere but never intruded on conversation. It was the kind of restaurant where anniversaries were celebrated, deals were closed, and quiet moments of importance unfolded over candlelight and carefully plated dishes. Ethan had chosen this place deliberately, knowing that Maddie had always loved it. It had been years since they had dined here, but he remembered how she had once called it our spot, back when they still had things that belonged only to them. He had planned the evening meticulously, making reservations weeks in advance to ensure they had the best table by the window. He had gone the extra mile, requesting her favorite vintage of wine, a deep, full-bodied red she had once said tasted like old love letters and late-night confessions. He had even arranged for a small, custom gift, a delicate gold bracelet with their wedding date engraved inside the clasp, something simple yet meaningful, a reminder of everything they had built together. He told himself that tonight wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about desperation. It was about hope, about finding a way back to each other before the silence between them became permanent. As he sat across from her, watching the flickering candlelight cast shadows across her face, he wondered if she could feel the weight of his efforts. Maddie looked effortlessly beautiful, as she always did, her blonde hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, her emerald green dress hugging her figure in a way that reminded him of the woman he had fallen in love with. But there was something in her expression, a careful detachment, the kind that spoke of obligations rather than desires. She had agreed to dinner, but she wasn't really there. He felt it in the way she barely met his eyes, in the polite way she sipped her wine, in the way she seemed almost impatient, as if she were waiting for something to be over rather than savoring the moment. Ethan tried to shake the feeling, pushing through the tension with a forced smile, raising his glass for a toast. "To us," he said, hoping she would hear the quiet plea beneath his words. Maddie hesitated for half a second before lifting her own glass. "To us," she echoed, but there was no warmth in it, just the mechanical politeness of someone fulfilling an obligation. He should have known then, should have understood that this night wasn't going to be the turning point he had hoped for, but he still held on. Still clung to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could fix what had been broken. Then, just as the waiter placed their entrees in front of them, Maddie set down her glass, leaned forward slightly, and with a voice as smooth as the wine she had been sipping, said, "I've been cheating on you for 2 years, and I'm leaving you." The words landed with a quiet finality, like a stone dropping into deep water. Ethan felt the world tilt for a fraction of a second, a moment of surreal detachment where his mind struggled to process the weight of what had just been said. But instead of reacting with anger or disbelief, instead of demanding an explanation or pleading for answers, he simply smiled. It wasn't forced, wasn't calculated, it was something else entirely, something raw and knowing, a reaction that made Maddie falter for the first time all evening. Her brows knit together in confusion, as if she had rehearsed this conversation in her mind 100 times, but had never accounted for this response. Before she could speak, before she could try to regain control of the moment, the restaurant door swung open. The sound of heels clicking against marble and the murmur of quiet conversations faded into the background as he walked in. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, Ryan Hale exuded the effortless arrogance of a man who had never been told no. Ethan didn't need to turn around to confirm his identity. He saw it in the way Maddie's face drained of color, in the way her hand involuntarily clenched against the tablecloth, in the way she suddenly looked like a woman caught in a disaster of her own making. Ethan simply leaned back, taking a slow sip of his wine, eyes locked on her. "Well," he said, setting his glass down with deliberate ease, "this just got interesting." A ripple of recognition moved through the restaurant like a slow-building wave. Conversations faltered, eyes darted toward the man who had just walked in, and in that instant, Ethan saw something shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just curiosity, it was contempt. A few whispered to their dinner companions, others exchanged knowing glances, but no one greeted him. No warm handshakes, no casual nods. Just the kind of restrained, simmering disdain reserved for men whose reputations preceded them. Ryan Hale either didn't notice or didn't care. He walked with the confidence of a man who had never once been made to answer for his actions, oblivious to or indifferent to the weight of his name in certain circles. Ethan leaned back, studying Maddie's reaction. She sat rigid, fingers pressing into the linen tablecloth, her expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and poorly masked panic. For the first time that evening, she looked afraid, not of Ethan, not even of the moment unraveling in front of her, but of something deeper, something she hadn't accounted for, She had planned to control this conversation, to dictate how this night would go, but she had made a critical miscalculation. She hadn't realized that Ethan already knew everything. His gaze flicked to Ryan, and for the first time in years, Ethan let himself fully acknowledge the man standing before him. It wasn't just about the affair. This wasn't just another man taking his wife. This was a man who had once stood in Ethan's way, deliberately, methodically, with the precision of someone who had never wanted to see him succeed. Ryan Hale wasn't just an attorney, he was a gatekeeper, the kind of man who wielded power like a scalpel, who disguised discrimination as policy, who kept men like Ethan in their place under the guise of standards and protocol. Years ago, when Ethan was on the brink of landing the biggest contract of his career, a multi-million-dollar redevelopment project in the city, Ryan had been the one to shut it down. Not because Ethan lacked experience, not because his designs were subpar, but because, as Ryan had so casually put it in a closed-door meeting, Ethan was an unproven risk. Unproven risk, a sanitized way of saying, "You don't belong here." Ethan had spent months fighting against the decision, digging into Ryan's legal history, trying to find something, anything, that would expose what everyone already knew but couldn't prove. Ryan had a history of blocking projects from minority-led firms, always justifying it with bureaucratic red tape and legal loopholes. Ethan never forgot that loss, the way he had swallowed the humiliation, the way he had forced himself to move on, to rebuild, to succeed despite men like Ryan Hale. And now, years later, here he was, the man who had tried to ruin him, the man who had dismissed him as insignificant, sitting across from Ethan's wife. The same woman who had once claimed to believe in everything Ethan stood for. His jaw tightened, fingers curling into his palm before he forced himself to relax. Not yet. He turned to Maddie, letting the weight of his silence settle before he spoke. "You didn't just cheat," he said, his voice low, measured, edged with something sharp. "You aligned yourself with a man who works against everything I stand for." Maddie's breath hitched, her lips parting slightly as if she had something to say, but nothing came out. She hadn't expected this. She had prepared for anger, maybe even heartbreak. She had not prepared for this kind of calm, lethal clarity. Ethan let the moment stretch, watching as the realization sank into her. "Tell me," he continued, tilting his head slightly, "was it easy to forget what I told you about him, to overlook what kind of man he is, or did you just not care?" Maddie swallowed, her throat bobbing visibly. "Ethan, No," he cut in smoothly, his voice still quiet, still unnervingly controlled. "You made your choice. Own it." Ryan shifted, finally sensing the conversation was veering into dangerous territory. "I don't think this is the time or place for—" Ethan held up a hand, silencing him with nothing more than a look. "You and I both know exactly who you are," he said, his voice steady, "and so does everyone else in this room." Ryan's eyes flicked around, scanning the restaurant, and for the first time Ethan saw it, a crack in the arrogance. The realization that this wasn't just another private confrontation, this was public. The carefully constructed walls of power and influence that Ryan had always relied on to protect himself suddenly felt a little thinner. Maddie sat stiffly, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass as if it were the only thing anchoring her. The air between them felt charged, electric with unspoken words and the weight of unchangeable choices. And then Ethan did something that made both of them flinch. He smiled. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, moving with the kind of deliberate ease that made both Maddie and Ryan visibly tense. He pulled out a sleek black folder, the edges crisp, untouched, as if it had been prepared for this exact moment. Without a word, he slid it across the table, his fingers releasing it with a quiet finality that sent a chill down Maddie's spine. She didn't move, didn't even blink, but her breathing had changed. Shallower, quicker. Ryan, on the other hand, exhaled sharply through his nose, clearly irritated by the theatrics. "What is this supposed to be?" he muttered. But Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, watching, waiting. Maddie hesitated, then slowly reached for the folder, flipping it open with fingers that had begun to tremble. The moment her eyes skimmed the first page, her entire body stiffened. Ethan saw it. The way her pupils dilated slightly, the way her jaw clenched just a fraction too tightly. A tell. She knew exactly what she was looking at before she had even turned the second page. Ryan, growing impatient, leaned in to glance over her shoulder. At first, his expression was unreadable, but as he took in the details, the arrogant ease he had carried since walking into the restaurant cracked. His brows pulled together, a flicker of confusion turning into something darker, something dangerously close to betrayal. Ethan tilted his head slightly, finally breaking the silence. "Go ahead, read it out loud, Maddie," he said, his voice smooth, almost conversational. She couldn't. So he did it for her. "Over the past 6 months, you've been draining our accounts. Not all at once, no, that would have been too obvious. Small transfers, a few thousand here, 5,000 there, always spaced out, just enough to avoid raising red flags. But when you add it all up, that's over 200 grand, Maddie. 200 grand quietly funneled from our joint assets into this account." He tapped the page with a single finger, watching her face twist as though she were trying to physically stop the words from landing. "An account. Under Ryan's name." Ryan stiffened. "Wait, what?" Maddie finally moved, snapping the folder shut so quickly the pages nearly crumpled. "Ethan, this isn't what it looks like," she started, her voice strained, but he just let out a quiet chuckle. "Oh, Maddie," he said, shaking his head. "It's exactly what it looks like." Ryan snatched the folder from her grip, flipping it back open, his eyes darting over the figures, his nostrils flaring as the realization sank in. "You've been using my name for this?" His voice had lost its smooth confidence, replaced with something sharp and accusatory. "What the hell were you planning, Maddie? To drain him dry and run off with my money instead?" For the first time that evening, Maddie looked genuinely shaken, not just caught off guard but truly afraid. "No, it's not like that," she said quickly, turning toward him. "I was going to tell you." Ryan's fist clenched against the table, his jaw tight as he stared at her. "Tell me what, exactly? That you were setting me up? That you were going to run once his money was in my account?" Ethan smiled again, slower this time, a predator watching his prey turn on itself. "Ah," he mused, swirling his wineglass lazily. "So you didn't know? That's interesting." Ryan turned back to Maddie, his expression dark. "Is that why you were rushing things? Pushing me to finalize everything? Were you planning to cut and run?" Maddie's lips parted, but for once she had nothing to say. Because there was no lie, no excuse, no well-crafted spin that could get her out of this. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "You thought you were smart, Maddie. You really did, but you made a mistake. You underestimated me. You thought I wouldn't notice the missing money, that I wouldn't track it, but the moment I felt something was off, I started looking. And once I started looking," he leaned forward slightly, his smile cold now, "I found everything." Maddie swallowed hard, but before she could attempt to salvage herself, Ryan abruptly stood, the chair scraping against the floor. His entire demeanor had shifted. He no longer looked like a man in control, no longer looked like the one in power. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd been played. "You're unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "I should have known." Ethan took another slow sip of his wine, watching Maddie struggle to find her footing, to find some way to regain control of the narrative that had so violently slipped through her fingers. But there was nothing left to grasp. Because the truth was already sitting right there, in black and white. Ethan took his time, swirling the deep red wine in his glass, letting the weight of the silence settle over the table. Maddie's fingers twitched against the edge of the tablecloth, knuckles white as she darted a glance at Ryan, who stood rigid, his jaw tight with barely concealed fury. The realization that she had played him just as much as she had played Ethan was sinking in fast, and for the first time since walking into the restaurant, Ryan no longer looked like the most powerful man in the room. Ethan set his glass down and with a slow, deliberate motion lifted his hand and gave a single nod. That was the signal. Immediately, the quiet murmur of the restaurant shifted. A scrape of chairs, the shuffle of movement, and then, one by one, people began to rise. A man near the bar, another from a nearby corner booth, and finally 2 women from separate tables along the edge of the room. Ethan didn't turn to watch them. He didn't need to. He already knew who they were. Joel Parker, his private investigator, had been working this case for months. A former detective turned independent PI, Joel had the kind of presence that made people think twice before underestimating him. Lean, grizzled, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He walked forward casually, resting one hand against the back of Ethan's chair, his other sliding into his pocket like a man who had all the time in the world. Beside him, the two women stood tall, their expressions a careful mix of controlled rage and satisfaction. They weren't just random people in the restaurant. They were victims of Ryan Hale. Women whose lives he had wrecked, whose businesses he had sabotaged, whose reputations he had dragged through the mud to serve his own interests. And then there was her. Charlotte Graves, a journalist known for exposing corruption in high-profile circles, stepped forward. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her eyes sharp as a blade, already assessing the damage before she even spoke. Ryan stiffened, his hands curling into fists as he scanned the room, realization dawning too late. Maddie, meanwhile, looked frozen in place, her gaze darting frantically between them, understanding finally that she had nowhere to run. Charlotte was the first to break the silence. "Ryan Hale," she said, her voice carrying through the restaurant with the kind of clarity that commanded attention. "Didn't expect to see me here tonight, did you?" Ryan's expression barely shifted, but Ethan could see it, the quick calculation, the desperate search for an exit strategy. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Ryan muttered, his voice low, controlled. Joel chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, you do." He pulled a thick sealed envelope from his pocket and tossed it onto the table in front of Ryan. "That's every document, email, and bank statement tying you to the fraudulent contracts, the hush money payoffs, and the shell companies you use to launder cash through your firm. It's airtight." He smirked, tilting his head. "You've been a very busy man." One of the women, Ava Marshall, stepped forward next, crossing her arms over her chest as she glared down at Ryan. "You ruined my company," she said, her voice edged with fury. "You made sure I lost every client, every investor, because I refused to play your game." Ryan turned toward her, his jaw tight, his mask beginning to crack. You blacklisted me," the second woman, Nadia Lee, cut in. "Told investors my firm was a liability, that I was unstable, all because I called you out on your contracts and insider deals." Charlotte didn't give him a chance to respond. She pulled out her phone and held it up. "And guess what? It's all going public. Tonight." Maddie visibly flinched. "Wait. Public?" she whispered, as if she had only just grasped the scale of what was happening. Charlotte's smile was razor-sharp. "Oh, don't worry, Maddie. You'll be in the story too." She tapped her screen. "I mean, it's not every day a marketing executive gets caught siphoning money from her husband to her corrupt affair partner's account. That's a headline." Maddie whipped around toward Ryan, her voice dropping to a frantic hiss. "Ryan, say something." Ryan didn't look at her. He was already calculating his escape, scanning the room, realizing he had been played, cornered, and Ethan saw it, the way self-preservation overtook everything else. Ryan took a slow breath, squared his shoulders, and then did exactly what Ethan had expected. He threw Maddie under the bus. "This wasn't me," Ryan said suddenly, stepping away from her. "I had no idea about the money transfers. That was all Maddie." Maddie staggered back like she had been slapped. "Ryan, what the—" Ryan turned toward Ethan, his expression shifting into something almost apologetic, as if he thought he could cut a deal and walk away clean. "Listen, Ethan, I think we can both agree that Maddie—" Ethan laughed. "Oh, don't you dare try to spin this like you're the victim here." Ryan clenched his jaw, his control slipping fast. "You don't have proof that I—" Joel sighed, pulling out his phone and tapping the screen. A second later, Ryan's voice filled the room. "A recorded conversation. She won't see it coming, the money will be in my name, and once it clears, we disappear." Maddie staggered back. "You son of a—" Ryan turned on her now, his mask completely shattered. "Oh, shut up, Maddie, you knew exactly what this was." The entire restaurant had gone silent, the weight of the confrontation sinking in. Ethan exhaled slowly, finally pushing back his chair, standing with calm, unwavering certainty. He looked at Maddie, at Ryan, at the wreckage of their own making. Then he turned to Charlotte. "Do it," he said. Charlotte tapped her phone one last time. And just like that, the world knew everything. The weight of the moment settled thick in the air, but before anyone could speak, a quiet voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Carter, sir?" Ethan turned his head, his eyes landing on a waiter standing just a few feet away. his hands clasped in front of him, expression cautious. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with the wary look of someone debating whether or not to speak up, but ultimately deciding that truth outweighed comfort. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Yeah? The waiter swallowed, shifting slightly on his feet before lowering his voice just enough for Ethan to hear. I think you should know. She's been bringing him here for months. Silence. Ethan didn't react immediately, didn't even blink. He just sat there, absorbing the words, letting them seep into his skin, into his bones. He could feel Maddie tense across from him, could hear the sharp inhale she took, but he didn't look at her, not yet. Instead, he turned his focus on the waiter, measuring the truth in his expression, in the careful way he avoided looking at Maddie entirely, as if he knew he had just detonated a bomb in the middle of the table. You sure about that? Ethan asked, his voice unreadable. The waiter nodded, firm now, as if he had decided that if he was going to say it, he wasn't going to back down. Yes, sir. Same table usually. Window seat. Always around this time of night. I remember because they always ordered the same wine, the one you requested tonight. Ethan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. It wasn't just an affair. It was here, in this restaurant. The one place he had chosen tonight because it had meant something. A place they had celebrated anniversaries, promotions, birthdays. A place that had once been theirs. Maddie shifted in her seat, her hand twitching as if she was about to reach for his but thought better of it. Ethan? He finally looked at her then, and whatever she saw in his face made her mouth snap shut. You didn't even have the decency to cheat somewhere else? His voice wasn't loud, wasn't sharp, but there was something in it, something so cold, so deeply disappointed, that it cut sharper than any shout ever could. Maddie's lips parted, eyes wide, scrambling for something, anything that could soften the moment. It wasn't. Don't? Ethan interrupted, shaking his head slowly. Just don't. Because now I get it. It was never just about lying, was it? It wasn't just about screwing around behind my back. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, voice dropping just enough to make her flinch. You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted to do it where you knew I'd eventually find out. Hell, maybe you wanted me to find out. Maybe you got off on it. Maddie's face burned red, her nails digging into the tablecloth. That's not true, she whispered. But even she didn't sound convinced. Ethan just laughed, shaking his head. Doesn't matter, because it's done. And now, so are you. The restaurant door swung open again, the faint chime of the entrance bell cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the table. Maddie barely reacted at first, her mind clearly still scrambling for an escape, but Ethan knew before he even turned his head who had just walked in. The energy in the room shifted, the kind that came when someone who was absolutely not to be messed with entered the space. Camille Carter strode in with the kind of confidence that came from years of tearing men like Ryan Hale apart in courtrooms. Tall, poised, and utterly unshaken by the weight of the moment, she moved with purpose, a sleek leather portfolio tucked under one arm, her expression sharp and unreadable. Ethan's older sister had always been a force, but tonight she was something more. Tonight, she was the executioner. She didn't acknowledge anyone else as she approached the table, didn't even glance at Maddie or Ryan. She walked straight to Ethan, resting a manicured hand on his shoulder in silent solidarity before shifting her attention to the man across from him. Ryan stiffened. Maddie, finally registering the shift, frowned, her confusion flickering into unease. Camille? What are you? Camille ignored her, setting the portfolio onto the table with a deliberate thud. Slowly, with the precision of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment, she unzipped it and pulled out a thick folder filled with printed documents. Without a word, she slapped it down in front of Ryan. Ethan watched as Ryan hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly before he forced himself to reach for the folder. He opened it, eyes darting over the first few pages, and Ethan saw the exact moment the color drained from his face. Camille tilted her head. Go ahead, she said, her voice smooth, lethal. Read it. Ryan said nothing. Maddie, thrown completely off balance, leaned in to look for herself. She had barely skimmed 3 sentences before she recoiled like she had been physically struck. Her mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. Ethan let the silence stretch, let her drown in it. Then finally he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Tell me, Maddie," he said, his voice deceptively light. "How does it feel to know you were never anything more than a pawn?" Maddie's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. This isn't real." Camille arched a brow. "Oh, it's very real." She flipped through the pages before settling on one in particular. With the air of someone revealing the final damning piece of evidence in a high-profile trial, she read aloud. "She's useful for now. She thinks she's playing me, but she doesn't realize she's just another piece on the board." The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around Maddie's throat. Her head snapped toward Ryan, her eyes wide, frantic. "Tell me this isn't real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tell me you didn't say that." Ryan didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. And that was all the confirmation she needed. Maddie's hands trembled, her entire body going rigid as the truth settled into her bones. She was never his partner, never his equal, never anything more than a temporary distraction, a tool he had planned to discard the moment she outlived her usefulness. Ethan exhaled, watching as the last remnants of whatever delusions she had clung to finally crumbled. Ryan pushed the folder away, his jaw tight. "You think you've won?" His voice was lower now, coiled with barely restrained fury. Camille smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that promised destruction. "Oh, honey," she said smoothly, "we're just getting started." Ryan stood abruptly, as if the very act of leaving could sever him from this moment. But Camille moved faster, stepping in front of him before he could take a single step. Her voice dropped, cold and sharp. "Sit down," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "You and I have unfinished business." And just like that, for the first time all night, Ryan Hale had nowhere to run. By sunrise, the world knew everything. Ethan woke to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand, notifications flooding in like waves crashing against the shore. He let it ring, let it vibrate, let it do whatever it wanted. He already knew what it was. While the city had slept, Charlotte had worked. The article had gone live at 5:42 a.m., and by the time the first round of coffee cups hit office desks, it had already exploded across every major news outlet. Social media was ablaze with headlines that spread like wildfire. Prominent attorney Ryan Hale exposed in corruption, fraud, and scandalous affair. Marketing executive Madeline Carter implicated in financial fraud and corporate misconduct. Legal titan faces disbarment after investigation uncovers years of shady dealings. It wasn't just a local affair, this was national news. Ethan finally picked up his phone and scrolled through the endless flood of messages, texts from colleagues, business partners, old friends. Some were checking in, others offering congratulations. Because in their world, power games were common, but seeing a man like Ryan Hale fall, that was rare. And Maddie, she had fallen right along with him. He threw back the covers and got up, stretching out the weight of the previous night. As he moved toward the kitchen, he turned on the TV, flipping through the channels until he landed on one of the morning news broadcasts. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "High-profile attorney's downfall, corruption, blackmail, and the affair that ended it all." The reporter's voice was crisp, detached in that professional way, but the words cut deep. In a stunning revelation last night, Ryan Hale, a prominent corporate attorney known for his high-profile legal battles, has been exposed for a web of fraudulent dealings, blackmail, and a 2-year affair with marketing executive Madeline Carter. Reports indicate that Hale engaged in unethical practices, including blocking minority-led businesses from high-value contracts, falsifying legal documentation, and using coercion tactics against former business partners. Additionally, leaked financial records show that Carter, who was married at the time, funneled funds into an account under Hale's name, allegedly in an attempt to secure a financial escape plan before the affair came to light. Ethan sipped his coffee, watching it all unfold, every piece of it. The camera cut to footage of Ryan leaving his firm's headquarters, shoulders tight, jaw locked, shoving past reporters as they hurled questions at him. "Mr. Hale, do you have a statement on the allegations? Is it true that your law firm has terminated your contract? What do you say to the victims of your legal manipulations?" Ryan didn't answer because there was no answer that could save him now. His firm had cut ties with him within hours of the article dropping. The partners had wasted no time drafting their official statement, making it clear that they were distancing themselves completely. Hale & Associates does not condone the actions outlined in recent reports and will cooperate fully with any forthcoming investigations. Effective immediately, Mr. Hale is no longer associated with our firm in any capacity. Ethan smirked. The man had spent years ruining lives, and now his own life was unraveling in real time. Then came the lawsuits. Camille had wasted no time. By noon, multiple former clients had come forward, each with their own set of grievances, each filing legal action against Ryan for fraud, contract tampering, and unlawful business interference. Some of the cases would take time to build, but others were already rock solid. He was looking at disbarment. Jail time wasn't off the table. And Maddie, her fall was just as brutal. The same morning news segment shifted to a new headline. Marketing executive terminated following financial misconduct allegations. It was over. Her company issued a swift and public termination, citing a breach of ethical conduct and fiduciary trust. In plain terms, they wanted nothing to do with her. The public fallout was even worse. Her name was everywhere. Her friends, the ones who had filled their weekends with wine tastings and luxury brunches, abandoned her like a sinking ship. They weren't going to risk their own reputations associating with her. She lost everything overnight. Her job, her social status, the illusion of control. So Ethan could only imagine what her phone must have looked like. Texts from friends who suddenly stopped responding. Calls from family members demanding to know what she had done. And yet, the one text she hadn't sent? The one to him. He wasn't sure if she was too ashamed, too angry, or too deep in denial to reach out. But it didn't matter. Because he wasn't going to save her. She had made her choices. Now she had to live with them. Meanwhile, Camille was making sure every single one of Ryan's victims got their justice. Ava Marshall, the businesswoman Ryan had sabotaged, had already begun rebuilding her company with Camille's legal support. Nadia Lee, the woman Ryan had blacklisted, was now preparing a public lawsuit, and from the way Camille had spoken to reporters, it was clear this wasn't just about bringing Ryan down. It was about making sure men like him never had power again. As Ethan switched off the TV and leaned against the counter, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. For the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't feel like he was drowning in unanswered questions. He didn't feel the weight of trying to fix something broken beyond repair. He felt free. And Ryan? Maddie? They were the ones left picking up the pieces. It was late, just past 9 when the knock came. A slow, hesitant tap, tap, tap against the wooden door. Ethan didn't move at first. He had been sitting on the couch, a glass of whiskey in one hand, the soft hum of music playing in the background. The kids were asleep upstairs, their steady breathing the only sound that truly mattered in the house anymore. He already knew who it was before he even stood up. Dragging himself to the door, he exhaled through his nose, rolling the tension from his shoulders before unlocking it. When he pulled it open, the porch light cast a dull glow over the woman standing in front of him. Maddie. She looked nothing like the woman who had sat across from him at Midnight Bistro that night, full of arrogance, certainty, and carefully curated detachment. She looked hollow now, stripped of whatever armor she had once worn. Her once perfectly styled blonde hair hung limp around her face, her makeup smudged, as if she had been crying before she even got here. She was thin, paler than he remembered, wearing a jacket too light for the cold night air, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Ethan just stood there, waiting. She shifted on her feet, licking her lips as if she were trying to figure out how to start, how to pull him into whatever desperate plea she had rehearsed in her mind before coming here. But no words would save her now. Finally, her voice cracked through the silence. Ethan, I lost everything. His grip tightened slightly on the doorknob, but his face remained unreadable. Maddie swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. Please, let's talk. He let the words sit there, let them hang in the cold night air between them, as useless as they were pathetic. Let's talk. She wanted to talk now? After everything. She had stood in that restaurant, confident, telling him she was leaving. She had sat across from him while another man walked through the doors, the man she had chosen over him. She had planned to rob him blind, to disappear into some fantasy she had built in her mind. And when it all came crashing down, when her carefully constructed world turned to ash, she hadn't come to him for forgiveness. She had come because she had nowhere else to go. Maddie shifted again, biting her lip. I wasn't thinking straight, Ethan. I made a mistake. I see that now. Her voice was fragile, but he could hear it beneath the surface. The expectation, the belief that if she just looked broken enough, he would let her back in. A mistake? Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slowly. A mistake? His voice was calm, but there was something razor-sharp beneath it. No, Maddie. Forgetting an anniversary is a mistake. Missing a flight is a mistake. What you did? That was a choice. She flinched. Ethan, You lied to me, he continued, his voice never rising. You stole from me. You humiliated me in public. You threw away our family, our marriage, everything. For what? For a man who used you as a convenient distraction. Maddie shook her head frantically, stepping forward. No, that's not what it was. Don't, Ethan cut in, his tone making her freeze. Don't stand here on my porch and lie to me. Not anymore. She looked like she might break apart, her shoulders curling inward, her lip trembling. Ethan, please, her voice cracked. I have nothing left, no job, no place to stay. She wiped at her face, swallowing a sob. I just need a chance to fix this. A cold, empty laugh slipped past his lips. There is no us anymore, Maddie. There hasn't been for a long time. And if you really thought you could show up here and I'd just, take you back? Forget everything you did? I wasn't in my right mind, she whispered desperately. I wasn't thinking clearly. Ethan tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. No, Maddie, you were thinking very clearly. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. You were clear when you were sneaking around with Ryan for 2 years. You were clear when you took money out of our accounts. You were clear when you let me sit in that restaurant waiting for my wife to tell me she was leaving me. You were clear when you made your choice. Maddie's face crumpled. Ethan watched her, but he felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no triumph, just clarity. She was nothing to him now. She was just a woman who had once had everything and thrown it away. Her voice was barely a whisper now. What am I supposed to do? For a brief moment, Ethan just looked at her, looked at the wreckage of the person she had become, and then, without another word, without another glance, he shut the door in her face. The lock clicked, and it was done. Ethan found solace in the steady rhythm of his hands working against wood, the scent of sawdust, the rough texture of raw material beneath his fingertips, the sharp sound of a chisel carving into grain. It all became his escape, his therapy, his rebirth. What had started as a distraction soon became an obsession. He spent late nights in the garage, shaping, sanding, building. There was something deeply satisfying about turning something rough and unrefined into something beautiful and lasting. Unlike his marriage, unlike the life he had once tried so hard to hold together, this was something that could not betray him. At first, he built furniture just for himself, creating pieces to replace what Maddie had taken when she left. A dining table, sturdy and solid, where his children could sit and share meals. A bookshelf for his daughter, who had recently discovered a love for reading. A handcrafted desk for his son, who needed a quiet space to work on school projects. It started small, but word got around. A neighbor saw a coffee table he had made and asked if he took commissions. Then, a friend from work requested a custom shelving unit. Soon, he had more orders than he could handle, and before he knew it, what had been a coping mechanism had turned into a full-fledged business. It felt good. Building something that was his, something that was growing, something that he controlled. There was no deception in this, no betrayal, just his craftsmanship, his sweat, his effort, turning simple pieces of wood into something valuable. And that's how he met her. Sophie Dawson walked into his life the way some people walk into a bookstore, quietly, unassumingly, but with a presence that made you want to look twice. She owned a small, independent bookstore in town, one of the few places that still smelled like real paper and ink, where people browsed shelves instead of scrolling through screens. He had gone there one Saturday, searching for a book for his daughter, and had found himself standing in front of the woman who would change everything. She was nothing like Maddie. Where Maddie had always been polished, calculated, Sophie was warm, effortless, genuine. She had a way of speaking that made people feel comfortable, a way of smiling that didn't feel like it was meant to impress anyone, it was just real. She had recognized his name when he paid at the register. Ethan Carter, she had mused, tapping the side of the card reader. The same Ethan Carter that builds furniture? I saw your work at a friend's place the other day. It's incredible. It caught him off guard. He wasn't used to being recognized for something that wasn't tied to scandal, betrayal, or Maddie's mess. He wasn't sure what to say, so he just nodded. Yeah, that's me. She grinned. I might need some new bookshelves for the shop. Think you'd be interested? That's how it started. Slow, simple, no expectations, no hidden agendas, no complications. Over the next few months, he built bookshelves for her store. She made him coffee when he dropped them off. She asked questions about his work, actually listened to the answers. They talked about things that weren't painful, things like favorite books, childhood memories, places they'd love to visit. It was easy. For a long time, Ethan had thought he would never be able to trust someone again. Maddie's betrayal had made him wary, made him question every motive, every intention. But Sophie? She never asked for anything, never pushed, never pried into his past. She just showed up, day by day, moment by moment, until Ethan realized he wasn't holding his breath around her anymore. One evening, after he had installed the last of her shelves, she handed him a beer instead of coffee. They sat on the floor of the bookstore, backs against the counter, the scent of fresh-cut wood mixing with the rich aroma of old books. You ever think about expanding? She asked, tilting her head toward him. Turning the woodworking into something bigger? He took a slow sip of his drink, thinking, I don't know. I like keeping it small. Feels personal that way. She nodded, considering. That makes sense, but I still think more people should see your work. It's special. He had heard compliments before, from clients, from friends, but somehow when she said it, it didn't feel like flattery. It felt like she actually meant it. A beat of silence stretched between them, comfortable but charged. Sophie took a breath, like she was about to say something, but then she hesitated. Ethan turned his head slightly, watching her. What? She let out a small, nervous laugh, shaking her head. Nothing. I like this. She glanced at him, eyes warm. I like spending time with you. Something in Ethan's chest loosened. It was such a simple statement, so unassuming, but it hit him harder than he expected. He set his beer down, turning fully toward her. I like spending time with you too. Sophie smiled, and for the first time in a long, long time, Ethan felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. Ethan had been waiting for Ryan to make his last desperate move. It came in the form of a lawsuit. The papers arrived on a crisp Monday morning, delivered by a stiff-looking courier who barely made eye contact as he handed over the envelope. Ethan didn't even need to open it to know what was inside. Ryan Hale was predictable, like every other man who had built his power on arrogance and manipulation. The claim? Defamation. Ryan was suing for irreparable damage to reputation, loss of professional standing, and emotional distress. The irony would have been hilarious if it weren't so pathetic. A man who had spent years ruining lives now claimed he was the victim. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, scanning the legal jargon, barely suppressing a smirk. Ryan was grasping at straws. His career was in freefall, his name permanently stained, his former colleagues treating him like a disease they couldn't afford to catch. His disbarment was still under review, but everyone knew how that was going to end. The lawsuits against him were piling up. Clients, former business partners, people he had exploited and discarded over the years. And yet this was the hill he wanted to die on? Pathetic. Ethan placed the papers down, picked up his phone, and dialed. Camille answered on the first ring. Let me guess, she said, her voice dry. Hale finally filed? Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Of course he did. Camille laughed, the kind of laugh that meant she was already 10 steps ahead. He just made the biggest mistake of his life. A week later, they were in court. Ryan showed up looking polished but frayed, like a man desperately trying to pretend he still had control. His expensive suit was tailored, his hair was perfectly styled, but his eyes gave him away. He was a man on the edge. Ethan, he walked in calm, prepared, utterly unshaken. The hearing was swift. Ryan's lawyer droned on about damaged reputation, false accusations, the alleged conspiracy against him. He painted Ryan as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign, claiming that Ethan had deliberately destroyed his professional standing with malicious intent. Then it was Camille's turn. She stood, her posture casual but commanding, and in less than 5 minutes, she dismantled everything. She laid out the evidence: emails, recorded phone calls, fraudulent contracts. She showed the timeline of events, proving that everything Ethan had revealed was fact, not defamation. Then, with deliberate precision, she introduced new evidence. A sealed file landed on the judge's desk. Ryan stiffened. Ethan leaned forward, watching his opponent finally realized he had walked into his own grave. Camille's voice was smooth, controlled. "This is a sworn affidavit from one of Mr. Hale's former associates detailing his direct involvement in case tampering, illegal payoffs, and falsified court documents. These are not accusations, they are facts." Silence. Ryan's lawyer opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to argue. Ryan's face turned ashen, his confidence shattered in real time. Ethan could see it, the exact moment the truth settled into his bones. He had lost. The judge barely hesitated. The lawsuit was dismissed on the spot, and within 24 hours, Ryan's disbarment was made official. By the end of the week, he was gone. No announcement, no statements, no fight, just a ghost of the man he used to be, fleeing the wreckage of his own making. Ethan never saw him again. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't look back. The late afternoon sun bathed the backyard in a warm golden hue, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed grass. Laughter rang through the air, light and carefree, as Ethan watched his kids chase each other around the oak tree at the far end of the yard. His son, now a teenager, was still just as protective over his younger sister as he had always been, but now there was an ease between them, a bond that had only grown stronger over the years. Ethan sat on the porch, a cold beer resting on the arm of his chair, his fingers lightly tapping against the wood he had built himself. Everything around him, the house, the yard, even the furniture inside, was something he had rebuilt with his own hands, something real, something permanent. Beside him, Sophie leaned against the railing, sipping from a cup of tea, her eyes following the kids with a soft, contented expression. She had become a constant in his life, her presence woven into the fabric of their everyday moments in a way that felt as natural as breathing. She hadn't replaced anything, she had simply become a part of everything. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't looking over his shoulder. He wasn't waiting for the past to creep back in, wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's betrayal. He had spent so long trying to understand why it happened, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out where he went wrong. But now, it didn't matter anymore. Pain had led him here. If Maddie had never walked into that restaurant and shattered his world, he never would have found this peace, this love, this life. Sophie shifted beside him, tilting her head slightly as she looked over at him. "You're quiet," she mused, her voice light. He exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. "Just thinking." She smirked. "Dangerous." Ethan chuckled, taking a sip of his beer before glancing at her. "You ever think about how life turns out? How sometimes the worst things that happen to us are the things that set us on the right path?" Sophie considered that for a moment, her eyes softening. "Yeah," she said, finally nodding. "I think about that a lot." Ethan looked back at his kids, his heart full in a way he had once thought impossible. "Betrayal isn't the end," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It's just the beginning of something greater. Strength isn't avoiding pain, it's rising above it." Sophie reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Ethan knew, with absolute certainty, that the best chapters of his story were still being written. Ethan let his gaze drift across the yard, watching the last rays of sunlight stretch over the grass, painting the world in a golden glow. The soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of his kids' laughter through the air. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything, not the burden of the past, but the depth of the present. This life, this moment, was something he had built from the wreckage, and damn if it didn't feel good to stand on solid ground again. He turned his beer bottle idly between his fingers, his grip relaxed, his shoulders at ease. Sophie gave his hand a gentle squeeze before standing, collecting their empty cups. "I'll be inside," she said, with that knowing smile, the one that had become a quiet reassurance in his life. She didn't need to say anything else. She understood him in ways that didn't require words. Ethan watched her walk inside, then exhaled slowly, shifting his focus back to the horizon. His mind wandered for a moment, back to all the twists and turns that had led him here. The betrayal, the chaos, the fall of people who thought they were untouchable. Maddie had never recovered from her downfall. Last he had heard, she was working odd jobs, barely scraping by, a ghost of the woman who once thought she was too good for the life she had thrown away. And Ryan? Gone. Vanished from the city, his name only brought up in hushed tones when people talked about the attorney who lost everything in a scandal too big to bury. In the end, the man who thought he could manipulate, steal, and destroy without consequences had become nothing more than a cautionary tale. Karma had done what karma always does. Ethan smirked to himself, shaking his head. He turned back toward the camera, leaning forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His expression shifted. Not angry, not bitter, just knowing. "Tell me," he said, voice low, steady. "Have you ever seen karma in action?" He let the words settle, his eyes flickering with something sharp, something undeniable. "Drop your craziest karma stories in the comments." He sat back, letting the invitation hang there, letting the weight of the question sink in. The screen slowly faded to black, but before the final frame disappeared, bold words flashed across the screen, the last message lingering like an echo. "Strength isn't about avoiding pain, it's about rising from it. The past can break you, or it can build you. The choice is yours."